Offense. I'm a Michigan fan, and when I set aside my rivalry dislike for Ohio State and think about them, I think about offense. Specifically, skill position elite NFL offensive players. I think of Michael Thomas at wide receiver, Paris Campbell at wide receiver as well. Same thing with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison. You could go down a scroll of how many great Ohio State wide receivers there are. I think of running backs. I think of NFL elite talented running backs like J.K. Dobbins, like TreVeyon Henderson. Heck, you could even say that Miyan Williams could start at multiple schools and ball out and do well. I think of quarterbacks as well. I think of Dwayne Haskins. Rest in peace for him. I think of Justin Fields. I think of CJ Stroud. And speaking of quarterback, I think of how each quarterback under Ryan Day keeps following this upward trend. The season that CJ Stroud just had, never threw a collegiate pass before, and he might be Ryan Day's best passing QB. The upward trajectory for Ohio State quarterbacks, and for years Ohio State has struggled to produce NFL quarterbacks. They just haven't panned out, whether it was under Tressel or Urban. It now seems like that those days might be finally coming to an end. Ohio State's offense, I think, is the number one offense for 2022. And I'm saying that as they have lost a great deal. They lost wide receivers Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, who are likely both going to be first-round picks. They lost tight end Jeremy Ruckert, who was one of the better tight ends in the nation, especially when it came to blocking. They lost Thayer Munford and Nicholas Petit-Frere, who were both on the offensive line. And those are guys who are going to be drafted, by the way. Two great offensive linemen. So Ohio State they have lost a lot on offense. They've lost five starters on offense. So they returned 6. That's returning a lot, the majority of your production, depending on what position you look at. And even then, I think that they're going to be once again the number one offense, as they were this past season. I think they led or were top 3, but I'm pretty sure they led the nation in points per game, according to ESPN, and you can look up this stat. I'm confident in it. They were the most efficient offense by quite a wide margin in the country. And we know that this past season, Ohio State's failures were mainly based around their defense. You can't expect your offense, and I'm being serious when I say this, your offense can't always carry your team. It cannot always score more than 30 points a game. There's going to be some games where it struggles, and a defense can help your offense. It can help take pressure off of them. And Ohio State's defense could just never do that. They couldn't stop Oregon. They couldn't stop Michigan. And at the end of the day, to a certain degree, that hindered Ohio State's offense and how it functioned. And Ohio State's offense in itself this past season did have a lot of green members on its team. TreVeyon Henderson and CJ Stroud were pretty young, Stroud never having thrown a collegiate pass before, Henderson being a true freshman. And still, I think this team is going to have the number one offense in the country. In my past video, my most recent one, I talked about Texas. And there are people who think that Texas can contend for the number one offense. And Texas has great skill position talent. They have Xavier Worthy and Ajay Hall at wide receiver. They have Bijan Robinson at running back. They have Quinn Ewers at QB, who just transferred from Ohio State. Ohio State, though, is on this entirely different plane, this entirely different level compared to most teams. I think the only team that I myself would put in the same category as Ohio State, or at least close to them, like maybe Ohio State's 1A, this team is 1B, the team would be Alabama. Alabama, by the way, just picked up another great wide receiver from the portal. adding on to Jermaine Burton and their already knowingly talented wide receiver room that will go well with Heisman quarterback Bryce Young, who returns. That's the only other team that I would put with Ohio State. And compared to them, just very briefly, I would say that Ohio State has the deeper wide receiver room. I'd say Ohio State has the better offensive line room. Tight end is pretty close. I would say the same thing with quarterback, though I would favor Alabama at quarterback just because one of their backups looked fantastic, and Bryce Young won the Heisman. Running back is pretty close too, but I would slightly favor, just by all-around depth, I would slightly favor Alabama. But I think Ohio State's offense at the moment and in the regular season, the 2022 regular season, will be better. Their wide receiver room just reloads. It's completely automatic. They lose Garrett Wilson, they lose Chris Olave, and in the Rose Bowl, as we saw Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka perfectly stepped in and looked like starters. They looked like starters. And then Jaxon Smith-Njigba in that Rose Bowl game got the most receiving yards, caught the most receiving yards out of every person in bowl game history. He holds the record for most receiving yards in a bowl game. It's amazing. And then you have a quality backup in Julian Fleming, too, who will probably be the fourth guy at wide receiver. So he's a quality backup. If he can stay healthy, he will be really good as well. We've seen flashes of what he can do. So the wide receiver room is deep. There might even be a fifth guy who just comes out, and despite the fact that he's not a starter, you see him come out of nowhere because Brian Hartline is just that good at developing wide receivers, and he's been a game changer for the Buckeyes ever since he arrived. The offensive line, it was one of the low points for the team this past season, and you saw that in the Michigan and Penn State games. Penn State didn't have the offense nor the home field advantage to assist them in a possible upset over the Buckeyes, but Michigan did. Michigan's pass rush really got through Ohio State's O-line, and their run defense played the best that they ever did in the regular season. Michigan's did. Penn State didn't get the exact same pass rush, not nearly the same that Michigan did, but their run defense was ferocious. It constantly frustrated Ohio State on offense, forcing them to take multiple field goals. So Ohio State fired their old offensive line coach and brought in Justin Frye, who's from UCLA. He was their offensive line coach from 2018 to 2021, and their offensive coordinator from 2019 to 2021. He's now their associate head coach and offensive line coach, and Ohio State, I think, is moving back, though correct me if I'm wrong. I think they're moving back from that 4-tackle system, which was pretty weird and certainly didn't help them in certain situations. They're moving back to that traditional 2-tackle, 2-guard, 1 center. The typical is what they're moving back to. And I think that's certainly going to help them. I think that their offensive line will improve. Does it improve to the point where it's the best in the nation? I don't know. I don't think it will be the best in the nation, but it should improve. Ryan Day, after this past season, really made, especially on defense, but with Justin Frye too in the offensive line, he made sure to get some quality hires to ensure that the direction of the program for Ohio State is heading in a direction that is still pursuing national titles. So the offensive line, they're deep, and we'll talk about the depth chart, the projected starting depth chart, which is provided by ourlads.com in a few minutes. At tight end, you have Cade Stover, you have Joe Royer, Mitch Rossi, G. Scott Jr. as well. So the tight end room, I think, is pretty good. Jeremy Ruckert, who was a great blocker, was a great receiving tight end as well, departs for the NFL draft. But Ohio State's pretty safe at tight end. At running back and quarterback, those, along with the wide receiver rooms, are some of the best in the nation. You have TreVeyon Henderson and Miyan Williams, which is a great 1-2 punch, and Evan Pryor showed off some of his speed, looked similar to Henderson in the spring game, so I'm anticipating we'll see more of him this fall. CJ Stroud, top 2 quarterback in the nation. Him and Bryce Young, I'd say you can switch either of them. 1-2, 2-1, whatever. And you couldn't be wrong in ranking them as long as both of them are in the top 2. I'd give some slight favoring to Bryce Young for now, just because I think he had the worst supporting cast this past season yet, and more so carried his team. I think Bryce Young carried Alabama more than CJ Stroud carried Ohio State, again, because of the worse offensive line for Alabama, some depth issues at wide receiver, and injuries at running back and such. And Bryce Young, just a phenomenal player. There's no disgrace for CJ Stroud by putting him behind Bryce Young. They're both elite quarterbacks, and if CJ Stroud ever goes down, which is possible, things happen. Kyle McCord looked better in the spring game, and you also have Devin Brown, who's a true freshman. Both of them are very talented, and they're going to only improve under Ryan Day's system. That's just me talking about every position on offense. I now want to move into the projected lineup and talk about some stats for some of the skill position players as well. So for quarterback, obviously, CJ Stroud is the projected starting quarterback. CJ Stroud in the 2021 season threw for over 4,000 yards, completed over 70% of his passes, averaged 10 yards per pass. He had 44 passing touchdowns, only threw 6 interceptions. He was only sacked 13 times, showing occasional ability to escape the pocket as well. Nice pocket awareness. He had a 186.6 passer rating. On the ground, you have TreVeyon Henderson, who's going to be the starting running back, but I also anticipate that Miyan Williams will get a lot of playing time as well. Henderson, one of the best running backs, probably the best running back in the nation in open space. He's not the greatest when it comes to power situations, but that's in a certain sense what Miyan Williams is for. Miyan Williams is more so of a power back, but he also has plenty of speed, plenty of agility, plenty of finesse. So that's going to be a nice 1-2 punch. Henderson had over 1,000 rushing yards this past season, 1,248 to be exact. He averaged 6.8 yards per carry, had a long of 68, and had 15 rushing touchdowns. He was also 4th in receiving yards with 312 receiving yards for 11.6 yards per reception and 4 receiving touchdowns. Really good receiver out of the backfield. And again, open space. If he just gets a few blocks, he's gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. If he's in open space, you're letting him go to the end zone. Miyan Williams had 507 rushing yards, and I think he dealt with occasional injuries too, which certainly hindered his appearance. At least I think he had 507 rushing yards. He averaged 7.1 yards per rush. He averaged more yards per carry than Henderson did. So he certainly has speed and explosiveness of his own. He's built in a certain way, pretty similar to Mark Ingram, J.K. Dobbins, short, stocky. He had 3 rushing touchdowns, and he also, Miyan Williams he had 74 receiving yards for 8.2 yards per reception. No receiving touchdowns, though. So Ohio State's running backs, they're mostly explosive, quick guys. They're not power backs like, let's say, Hassan Haskins or another power back. I don't know many other power backs besides the one from my own team this past season, but Miyan Williams most closely resembles that role. And seeing how shifty and quick they are, as long as they have a good O-line, you're not going to need a guy who can just fall forward for an extra yard or two to get you through a game. With how explosive they are, with catching the ball, rushing the ball, the running back room is set for success. On the interior O-line, Luke Weipler is the projected starting center. Donovan Jackson and Matthew Jones are your projected starting guards. An offensive tackle, Paris Johnson Jr. and DeWand Jones are your projected offensive tackles. And Donovan Jackson, I think, was a 5-star. He was a part of that really elite 2021 recruiting class for Ohio State. I think he's going to have a big year. I think he was on the All Big Ten team this past season. I think third team or honorable mention, but he did well. The offensive line, again, wasn't even that bad this past season. But when you're at a program like Ohio State, just being good or even great isn't good enough. You got to be elite. You got to constantly get high-profile guys, blue-chip prospects, and the offensive line coach, the past one, struggled to do that. So that's why Justin Frye was brought in. I think the offensive line will improve. Some of the struggles this past season were due to, again, a lot of new green team members because of a lot of lost experience. Ohio State was one of the worst teams by returning production from 2020 entering 2021. So there was a lot of new players, a lot of new faces, a lot of youth, which can result in some silly mistakes. And that applied to Stroud, especially early on. It applied to Henderson. It applied to the offensive line. And I think that having some more returning production will certainly help the Buckeyes this season. At tight end, your projected starter is Cade Stover. Cade Stover had only 5 receptions this past season for 76 yards, 15.2 yards per reception. Obviously, when you have Jeremy Ruckert and Ohio State's more of a spread, more modern team, you're rarely going to see 2 tight ends on the field if you're Ohio State. So Jeremy Ruckert was the main tight end. He had over 300 receiving yards. And Cade Stover didn't see, obviously he was a backup, and being a tight end on Ohio State, you're not going to see a great amount of action, but he looked good in the spring game along with G. Scott Jr., and I think Ohio State's tight end room, while not being the deepest in the conference or necessarily close to it, I think that Iowa and Michigan and Purdue, who returns both of their starting tight ends, will have deeper tight end rooms. Their tight ends are going to be far from bad. They're going to be good. They're going to be solid at blocking. They're going to be reliable receivers for Ohio State. But speaking of receivers, finally, the wide receiver room. With Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson leaving, will this room take a step back? And to a certain degree, that's not even really the correct question to ask because of how phenomenal they were. The question is, how far of a step back will this room take? I think it'll take just a small step back. I think that with the phenomenal talent, especially that Garrett Wilson was, and the leader and the developed talent that Chris Olave was, both of them leaving at the same time, it's tough. That's tough. It's tough to improve off of that. And I don't think they'll improve off of that because they already had by a mile the best wide receiver room in the country this past season. Maybe the best wide receiver room or one of the best in history. But that's not going to hold back the entire offense, as again, I think the offensive line will improve. I think CJ Stroud and Henderson, the QB and running back rooms too, will improve as well. Wide receiver is only going to take a few baby steps back, in my opinion. Emeka Egbuka, Marvin Harrison Jr., really great talents out of high school. They looked like they perfectly fit in their starting roles and their respective roles in the Rose Bowl. And Jaxon Smith-Njigba might have been the best wide receiver on Ohio State's team this past season. Smith-Njigba, he had 1,606 receiving yards on 95 receptions, and he averaged 16.9 yards per reception, and he had 9 receiving touchdowns. Emeka Egbuka was next up on the projected starting lineup when it comes to receiving yards from this past season. He had nearly 200 receiving yards, 21.2 yards per reception, but 0 receiving touchdowns. Marvin Harrison Jr., who saw most of his action in the Rose Bowl, had 139 receiving yards for 12.6 yards per reception and 3 receiving touchdowns. Also look out for Julian Fleming, who this past season had 86 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. Again, he's probably going to be that 4th guy, and he could, if he stays healthy, he can be a really good wide receiver. He was a 5-star talent out of high school, and don't expect him to be a quote-unquote bust as some people like to call him, forever, as long as he stays healthy. That's all I really have to say for this video. This is the projected starting lineup, again, according to ourlads.com. It was last updated yesterday at 8:52 p.m., and because of that, I assume that it is, for the most part, reliable. It's been reliable in the past. If you have any differing opinions on the starting lineup, or just any opinions of your own, I encourage you to comment down below, as I love having discussion with any college football fan about really any team, but specifically Big Ten teams. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on Ohio State's offense down below. Do you agree with me and think that it'll be the best in the Big Ten and the entire nation? Or do you think that another team, or even bolder, another few teams will have a better offense? Tell me down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.